Thinking positive is the first step to leading a positive life.
They watched the quarantine crumble apart. A few deserters were executed, but panic spread like wildfire, and it quickly became impossible to contain. Jennifer's suicide had spun them all into action. As far as Harriet could tell, Jennifer's corpse proved a substantial biological threat. Her close proximity to the barricade ignited an already bubbling fear in the already frightened soldiers. They were seeing the infection firsthand, and they didn't want to get any closer. They must have not known how virulent the infection could be. Most soldiers had had enough with standing around, wondering if one of them was going to start coughing and bleeding from every orifice. Most soldiers fled in fear of the impending infection. The remaining students, Eddie, Lou, Harriet, Jonas, and Andrew, watched the chaos unfold before them. They listened to the cries, smelled the cordite in the air, and felt the panic emanating from the barricade. A few hours later, the camp was completely abandoned. They watched it in silence for a few minutes. The realization dawned on all of them at almost the exact same time. All their faces lit up with jubilation. The soldiers were actually gone. The soldiers who had trapped them inside the school, shot at them, and killed their teacher had abandoned their post. Harriet was the first to speak.
There's no one keeping us here. We can finally get out of...
A fit of coughing doubled her over. She hacked and coughed up a storm. She covered her mouth and silently prayed that it wasn't what she thought it was. The others watched her coughing fit. Andrew was the first to make the assumption.
I knew you had it. Of course you had it. Your body's already riddled with STDs. You're a goddamn pestilence. You're gonna give it to all of us.
Harriet tried to speak between the coughs.
No, it's not...
Jonas looked at her for a few seconds before he turned and slowly left the classroom. She couldn't tell what expression was on his face, whether it was fear or sorrow. Andrew said,
There you have it. Even fucking Rain Man knows when you're infected.
She wheezed.
And just go.
Wakefield snapped.
I can't risk your ass following us and spreading the sickness. You have to die here.
Andrew took a step forward and she shrank back from him. She winced and squeezed her eyes shut. She expected to feel his hand wrap around her throat or push her towards a window. Those things didn't happen. She opened her eyes to see Eddie standing between her and Wakefield.
You aren't touching a hair on her head. You're going to have to kill me first.
Wakefield stepped forward and began.
Don't think I would...
Eddie punched him, hard. He staggered back and looked up with unbridled rage burning in his eyes. Seconds passed slowly between them. Andrew finally declared,
If you want to get one of her many infections, go ahead. Don't come crying to me when you're coughing and hacking from the clap.
Still not a symptom of gonorrhea.
Whatever, Nerdlinger. Fuck you.
He turned around and left the classroom. The classroom was as still as the grave. Harriet coughed again. Eddie looked at Lou and said,
I'm staying with her.
Something seemed to unfold between the two good friends. Lou realized that Eddie wasn't going to change his mind. He gave a slight nod to his friend, and turned and left the classroom to go outside. The man recalls memories of a life that only he knows. Such beauty and bittersweet memories. So it goes. Lou ran down the empty hallway. In his food-deprived mind, he imagined the students that once walked these halls, and the small number who had called this place their tomb. It was an interesting thought brought about by his degrading mental state. He had to catch up with Andrew Wakefield. He sprinted down 2 flights of stairs and reached the lobby. He paused for a few seconds. Fear welled up within him, as he wasn't sure he could actually bring himself to step outside. There were 2 things that gave him pause. The first was the sinking suspicion that the second he stepped outside, he would be torn apart by gunfire like their teacher. The second reason was hesitation. He didn't want to pass the corpse of Jennifer who killed herself. He let her go to fall to her death. He poked his head out the door, and after a few seconds, he decided that there were no soldiers left. He stepped outside and felt the sun warm his skin. The air was fresh, and he realized that the school behind him smelled like decomposition. He had grown so accustomed to it, he hardly even noticed it. Lou walked up to Jennifer's body. Her body looked like a marionette that had been cut from its strings. Her limbs were splayed out in all directions and bent at odd angles. He knelt by her corpse and closed her eyes. A part of him wanted to spit on her corpse for killing his friend, but the other part just felt sad. Sad at what she had become. Sad at what they had all become. The sound of the chain-link fence drew his attention away from Jenny McCarthy. Andrew was a few yards away from him, rattling the fence of the barricade. Andrew snarled to no one in particular.
They thought they were so tough behind these barricades and the barrels and rifles, but they were just pussies. I thought government spooks were supposed to be ballsier than that.
Don't think any government official's staying behind to listen to you. It's a shame, really. You have such a way with words. The instigator turned and looked at the musician for an instant longer than a standard blink before responding.
Good timing. Give me a boost over this fence.
No. Andrew looked at him as if he had grown a second head before letting go of the fence and roaring.
You really think they gave a fuck about us? They're just waiting until we all get it and kick the bucket so they can just put us in a freaking petri dish and see how everything worked. I'm not gonna wait for that to happen. I'm getting out.
Well, you could infect other people.
Fuck them. They don't care about us. Why should I care about them? Every single goddamn person in this town is culpable. They may not have infected us or built the barricade, but they sure as shit didn't do anything to stop the army or save us. Their apathy makes them just as bad as these assholes.
Lou countered. You would risk infecting your family, your friends, just for a few hours of freedom?
Family? I didn't see my family lining up at the barricade, demanding my release. Didn't see yours either. Friends? They bailed the second they got the chance. They're no friends of mine. We're all alone here. So I'm gonna do what I want from now on. If you dare bring up any jingoistic follow the government's mandate, I'll punch you in the throat. Uncle Sam can eat an entire bag of dicks for all I care.
He turned back to the fence. He slid his fingers into the chain-link fence and asked,
Are you gonna help me or not?
Lou paused for a moment and answered, I can't let you do that. You could infect them all. We can't risk it. I have family and friends out there.
You gonna stop me? Do you think you can stop me?
I guess I have to. Andrew heavily sighed, let go of the fence, and cracked his knuckles whilst he approached the other student. His attempt at looking like an intimidating badass failed due to his starved and fatigued appearance. Lou solemnly realized that he was no better off. The lack of food had really equalized any advantage that one may have had over the other. Lou leaned back to avoid a punch meant to finish the fight quickly, and delivered a quick jab to Andrew's solar plexus. He stumbled back and grunted in shock, more than in pain. A lack of food had robbed his attacks of any real power, and left everything feeling dull and muted. The stunned student quickly recovered and charged forward whilst throwing a haymaker, hoping to catch him off guard. The musician sidestepped the blow and the instigator lost balance and fell to the ground. Lou turned to the fallen student and realized how hard it was for him to maintain his balance. He would have to end this fight quick, or run the risk of passing out from exhaustion. Lou closed in to pin him to the ground, but Lou pushed up off the ground and lashed out at the approaching man with his foot as hard as he could. Lou was lucky the attack glanced off his leg rather than hitting him in the knee. A few inches lower and that kick would have shattered his patella. The force of the kick sent him tottering backwards as he fell back into the fence. The exertion had left them both feeling dizzy, but neither wanted to give up. Both boys struggled to their feet to continue the conflict that had been bubbling within them ever since they were put into quarantine.
MKUltra was a US government-funded project focused on finding a truth serum to out communist spies. Mind-altering drugs and torture was inflicted on unwilling participants.
Andrew got to his feet first and charged Lou and pinned him up against the fence. With his target pinioned against the fence, he quickly unleashed a flurry of blows directed at his abdomen. The musician could only try to fend off the blows and the urge to empty his already empty stomach. The fence shivered and clicked under the force of Andrew's onslaught. The blitz lasted until Lou managed to drive his knee into the instigator's stomach and push him back. Lou grabbed Andrew and tripped up his feet whilst pushing him back. The two crashed to the ground with Lou on top, pinning him down. Wakefield shielded his face as Pasteur rained down punches on him. He frantically tried to protect his head whilst looking for an opportunity to counter. The blows made Andrew's vision go blurry. His perfect opportunity arose when his aggressor leaned back to deliver a strong punch. His hand struck out and caught Lou in the space between his shoulder and chest. His thumb dug into the stab wound that Lou had sustained in his fight with Geraldo. His thumb probed and tore into the wound and reopened any of his body's attempts at closing over the injury. He grasped at Andrew's hand but found he couldn't knock it away or dislodge it. The pain was so sudden and intense that he tried to lean away from the injury. Andrew sat forward and brought his free left hand to the left side of Lou's face. He cradled his cheek for a second before twisting his body and swinging his left hand down with all of his strength, slamming Lou's head into the pavement. He quickly moved on top of the stunned man and straddled his stomach so he couldn't wiggle free. His hand lanced around his throat and he slammed Lou's head back against the pavement. When he was sure that he was stunned, his grip tightened on his throat and he began to throttle the life out of him. Andrew ignored Lou's feeble attempts to push him off and free himself from his enemy's grasp. The blows were ineffectual, and Andrew tightened his grip on Lou's throat, emboldened by the feeling that victory was close at hand. Lou's hand sank down to his waist. Andrew was too focused on Lou's reddening face to even feel him striking him in the stomach. He continued choking him for a few moments until he was sure that it was over. He felt the moment when his body stilled beneath him and the blood stopped pumping through his carotid arteries. He continued choking him. Lou was dead. Andrew studied Lou's purplish face and bloodshot eyes, where vessels had ruptured whilst he was choking him. This was the first time he had killed someone at such close range.
You stupid son of a bitch! You could have helped me over the fence and then we could have gone on our separate ways. But you had to play the role of the military's marionette.
It wasn't until Andrew Wakefield tried to stand that he realized that something was horribly wrong. He stared down dumbfounded at the crimson stain now blooming through his shirt. It took him a few seconds for the pain to intensify and register. It felt like there was a ball of fire in his belly. He was confused until he saw what Lou was clutching in his slowly cooling hand. The butterfly knife peeked out from the musician's clenched fist. It wasn't until his mind connected the pieces that were before him that he gave an impotent roar. He gingerly lifted his shirt and gaped in horror at the 3 stab wounds in his gut. He shakily rose to his feet and walked towards the barricade. His hands clutched at his stomach in response to the morbid thought that his intestines might slip out from his belly and begin flapping obscenely against his waist if he didn't apply pressure. When he was close enough, his fingers gripped the chain-link fence, and he tried to pull himself up. He had the sudden, horrifying thought that his intestines would get caught up in the fence, and he would be disemboweled during his attempt to escape. Pain flared up in the core of his body at his attempt to scale the fence. He dropped back down to the pavement below him. He felt sick to his stomach and tasted copper. He pressed his back to the fence and sank down to the ground. He numbly realized that there was no way he was going to climb the fence in his condition. He spoke through gritted teeth and a pool of tears.
So close to the gates of heaven, only to find them barred.
He told himself he was weeping from the pain and multiple stab wounds in his stomach. But it was something more than that. He was dying and he knew it. It wasn't the thought of death that made him break down, but the fact that he was so close to escaping. He cried, and through misty eyes, He watched the blood slowly drain out of him and pool below. The world was slowly beginning to dull and turn monochrome. Andrew Wakefield's last thoughts were slightly reassuring to him.
At least the government isn't going to strap me down to a gurney and vivisect me.
He died with freedom, a few feet away.
Proceedings of the National Academy of the Sciences have theorized that oxytocin can stimulate feelings of affection, but can also trigger interpersonal conflict and aggression.
Edward Jenner sank into a chair as soon as Andrew and Lou left the room. Punching that asshole in the face has taken more out of him than he realized. His adrenaline was working overtime, and it wasn't making the starvation pains in his stomach feel any better. He knew that if Andrew had started a fight, he probably would have been thoroughly trounced. It was his lucky day. That thought came out sounding ironic. He blew out a deep breath as he was about to ask Harriet Patricia Wagner how she was, when she broke down in tears. Her body seemed to sag like a massive weight had been dropped onto her shoulders. She covered her mouth and eyes as she wept into her hands. It stifled a little noise, but it was still a heart-rending sound. Eddie tried to remember if he had ever seen Harriet cry. He thought back to all the horrible things they had seen. Their teacher shot to death in front of them, Patrick Finnegan's death and Michaela's execution. He realized that she hadn't cried that entire time. Now that it was practically the end, she couldn't help but let out her pent-up hopelessness. He thought that it would be best to give her some time to herself, but something made him step forward. He had never really tried to comfort someone so emotionally distraught before. The thought of saying or doing something wrong was typically a strong enough motivator to dissuade him, but at this point, that thought was a dull buzzing buried before a wall of starved delirium. She was so wrapped up in breaking down that she didn't even notice Eddie until he was a few feet away. She looked up at him, her eyes bloodshot and tears streaming down her face. His words caught in his throat as they came rattling out of his mouth.
Just let it out.
Harriet caught Eddie off guard when she buried her face into his chest and wept. Unsure of what to do, Eddie just stood there and let her weep against him for a few minutes. He could only mumble words that he thought were reassuring.
Let it all out.
The floodgates broke and deep sobs racked her body.
You've been so strong and optimistic for us all. Just let it all out.
He raised an arm and wrapped it around her shoulders, unsure of what else to do. She continued to suppurate, and Eddie continued to hold her. The crying subsided after a few minutes. Harriet slowly pulled away and stared down at her feet. Eddie realized that she was doing the same posturing he himself experienced when he was in an awkward situation. She spoke softly.
Sorry about drenching your shirt.
Eddie looked down and realized that her tears had soaked into his shirt. He responded,
Don't worry about it. I think it was pretty dirty to begin with.
She laughed at the slight joke. They had worn the same clothes for over 2 weeks now, and there was little anyone could do to make them smell worse than they had already smelled. There was a long pause in the almost empty classroom before she asked him,
Why? Why did you stand up for me? I'm probably infected.
Eddie shrugged and said,
I guess it's because you've done so much to keep everyone's spirits up. That to not help you in your time of need just seemed like a stupid thing to not do. You're a great person, and I knew that I couldn't let him kill you. Besides, it's not like there's anything
He let those words trail and felt them die in the air. He didn't want to finish that train of thought. She already knew that it was over. He didn't need to restate it. Harriet straightened up and asked with a cracking voice,
What have we become? We
watched Andrew kick Michaela out of a window, and Jennifer fall to her death because we just let it happen. So many people have died and we just... She was on the verge of breaking into a fresh set of tears, so Edward said the only thing that he felt comfortable saying. We did the only thing we could do. Nothing. There was nothing we could have done, and we can't keep looking back at our mistakes. She looked glumly at him before responding. Thanks for everything. She closed the distance between them and kissed his cheek. He flushed at his first exposure to any form of affection from the opposite sex. He could have panicked at the thought of getting infected, but at this point, he couldn't muster up the fear and fervor. He was all right with this. Edward's face began to feel hot, and he desperately wished she wasn't looking right at him. She jokingly scrutinized him for a second before asking, Are you blushing? He hadn't realized that he'd begun to blush from just a peck on the cheek. He quickly started to rationalize in a stammering staccato.
No, I'm just...
She interrupted. That's just adorable. There was a pregnant pause in the classroom. The somber mood had been replaced by something else entirely that he hadn't experienced or known before. Harriet looked at Edward, who stared back at her. He sensed that there was something between them. He shut off that questioning voice in his mind and did what he wanted to do since he had first met her a few years ago. He reached a hand up and brushed a stray lock of hair away from her face before she leaned in and kissed him. It was his first real kiss. It was romantic. The grass will always be greener on the other side. Harriet just let the moment sweep over her like a wave and guide her along. One moment she was passionately kissing Edward Jenner, and the next she was pushing him onto his back. He gave slight resistance, but he was also caught up in the moment. She was surprised by how sweet his breath tasted against her probing mouth. He kept rising to meet her, but she kept pressing him back down. It wasn't until her hands found his belt buckle and started to undo it that he finally spoke up. He pulled away from her and said, I don't think... Maybe we should hold off for a bit. Harriet pulled him into a quick kiss and cooed. There's no time like the present. I want this. Don't you want the same thing? She studied his face and read that he wanted the same thing, but was just a little more hesitant. There was something holding him back. She asked, Are you a virgin? He looked at her for a few seconds as if he was trying to decide before saying, I am. Do you want to stop then? She slowly began to lift her weight off of him, but found his hands against her waist, pulling her back down against him. There's nothing I want more in the world than to be with you right here, right now. She leaned forward and swallowed him up in a wave of kisses. The moment was extremely ephemeral. She knew it could be. It didn't matter. She still wanted this. She wanted that moment of connection, even if it was the last. He looked into her kind and gentle eyes and was about ready to apologize when she began to cough. She coughed up a fine red mist that spattered onto Edward's cheeks and into his eye. Both felt their breath catch in their throat from the shock of what just happened. Harriet had just coughed up blood in Edward's face. If he wasn't infected before this moment, he sure was now. He wiped the crimson stain off of his face, which only succeeded in smearing it on his face, and tried his best to smile. She cried out, You gotta get away. I'm not going anywhere. What are you talking about? You have to get out of here before I infect you. Edward looked her in the eyes and said, It doesn't matter anymore. It stopped mattering the instant Patrick died if he was infected. All that matters now is choosing what we do with our time left. He hugged her tight to his body, and she could feel his heart beating through his chest. It was a comforting sensation. When he pulled her back, her eyes were misting up. He planted a kiss on her forehead. She brought her right hand around the back of his neck and pulled him into another kiss. They made love that day. They spooned in the afterglow. The sensation of Eddie's hot breath puffing up against the back of her neck made the hair stand on end. She coughed and asked, "So what now?" He paused a second as if weighing all the options before saying, "I have no idea. I guess we wait and make the most of our time." They held each other until they dozed off. Harriet woke up sometime later coughing. She brought up more blood. She was glad she wasn't facing Edwin. She didn't want to think about waking him up by coughing blood on his face. He was still sleeping. She savored the silence. It was one of those moments that didn't come along too often. She had had sex a few times, but this really felt like the first time she made love. She could count her experiences on a single hand, but somewhere along the way, the stories and gossip about her grew. She shut the thought out of her mind and focused on the tranquility of the moment. She ruined that moment by coughing again. It hurt to breathe. She knew her time was running short. Her breath came out in ragged rasps. She felt something wet trickle down her cheek. She wiped at the blood and softly spoke. "Eddie, I'm scared," he whispered back to her. "I know, but you're not alone." Her worst suspicions were confirmed when he began coughing. She felt something spatter across her shoulder. She wanted to turn around to confirm whether or not it was blood, phlegm, or saliva, but realized that it would do nothing to reveal her dire condition to him. Instead, she closed her eyes and listened to him cough. Harriet's voice cracked as she spoke to no one in particular. "I don't want this. I had so much I wanted to do. So much." "I know. Why haven't you left?" He spoke without mincing words. "You shouldn't die alone. I'm scared too." It felt like she was breathing underwater in a viscous red fluid. When she coughed, she hacked up more blood. She felt weak. Eddie turned her towards him and looked at her in the last stage of infection. She croaked. "I don't want to die." Eddie turned in a cracking voice. "I don't want you to die. I love you." She looked at him through tears of blood and whispered, "I love you too." He leaned in and kissed her on the forehead as she coughed, cried, and choked. Even if it wasn't love, it was at least comfort. He pulled her close to him when she began wheezing. She hazily thought, "As far as endings go, I guess it could have been much worse." She wanted to tell Eddie something, but she found she didn't have the strength to speak. She was so exhausted. They held each other and waited for the end to take them. Most likely we were all infected, myself included. Not much left to do now but wait. There's one more thing I wanted to see. Jonas couldn't bear it. When Harriet had started coughing, he knew that it had spelled the end for them. The group would fracture and crumble in on itself. His only solace was to leave. He had been with them for so long, and he could think of nothing more peaceful than finding solitude. He turned and left them without saying goodbye. I was never good at saying goodbye. In all honesty, I was never good at saying anything. He walked the hallways aimlessly. The school had changed so much since the quarantine had begun. One floor below them was a classroom full of corpses. A classroom to his right was filled with trash and excrement from when they were too frightened to leave the third floor due to the military's retribution. He opened the janitor's closet and pulled down the ladder to the roof. He knew that the janitor snuck up onto the roof to smoke due to how he smelled after his breaks. He slowly ascended. He was dizzy and his stomach was a tidal pool of sloshing gastric acids. He climbed up onto the roof. He stood on the edge and looked over the small community. There weren't any people moving around in the city limits, but he could see cars driving around the highway. Life goes on. That thought, which should have disturbed him, brought him comfort. Good. Being a wallflower was always my best skill. His stomach growled in agreement and sent a horrible cramp throughout his core. He clutched at his stomach as he fell onto his back. Jonas knew that his body was in the process of shutting itself down. He had expended too much of his energy and starvation was taking its toll. He'd probably burned through all of his reserves and his body was beginning to tick down the hours he had left. He wondered what was going to kill him first, the sickness or starvation. He realized that thoughts like that were pointless. Now was the time to reflect on the successes and failures. He lay all the way down on the school roof and looked up at the sky. He wondered if Lou, Andrew and Harriet, or Edward were going through the exact same thing. He knew Harriet had been infected, but he kept telling himself that she would be all right. He knew that he was deluding himself with those kinds of thoughts. He remembered sipping a bottle of cheap vodka with them. It was a pleasant memory. It may have been the fact that he was looking up at the sun, but his eyes started to well up with the tears. He rubbed them away and vowed to think about other things. He couldn't change what had happened. He desperately wanted to thumb his nose at God and shout blasphemies into the void, but he knew it was pointless. Life goes on. He had tried so hard to prevent horrible things from happening, but he had failed. He watched the clouds drift by. It was quite peaceful. He let the sun warm his body. For the first time in a couple of days, he actually felt content. Jonas realized that he really wanted to see the sunset more than anything. The thought of waiting for it seemed like such an insurmountable task. He was so tired. He thought of closing his eyes for a second, just for a second, but knew that he probably wouldn't wake up after that. He forced himself to stay awake as he watched the sun trail across the sky. It felt like an eternity, but he refused to give in. Not yet. He watched the sun sink into the horizon and be swallowed up. His last words were, "That was truly something." He closed his eyes. Around him, the world continued spinning, as if nothing had happened.